miles from nowhere. It's hard to believe such a paradise really exists. For most sailors on the South Pacific, Palmyra is a stop on the way to somewhere else. But for a few, it's a destination of its own, a place to disappear from the world. That's just what happened to Mac and Muff Graham, although it wasn't their intention. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Crime on the high seas falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The disappearance of the Grahams and their yacht suggested trouble in paradise. The problem was, there was not a shred of evidence to prove it.
Palmyra Atoll is a series of small islands in the South Pacific, formed by a coral reef which surrounds a lagoon. It is owned by the United States, and during World War II it housed a U.S. Navy base. The remains of the deserted base are still on the island today. It is located approximately 1,000 miles from Hawaii, and is a stopover point for sailors and yachtsmen on their way to Samoa. Oftentimes, large, beautiful sailboats can be seen at the broken-down docks in its lagoon. But on June 26, 1974, a small sailboat named the Iola made its way past the docks and into Palmyra's makeshift harbor. She had just completed a difficult 19-day journey from Hawaii, carrying a crew of 2. The boat was not suitable for the trip, and now limped into the lagoon barely seaworthy. The ship's motor had frozen up about halfway to Palmyra. Before leaving Hawaii, the owners had repaired the Iola, which was a wooden boat, by covering it with a coat of fiberglass. The friction created by these two materials caused a crack to form in the hull. On the way to Palmyra, the Iola had begun to take on water. They had little money and very few provisions. Their plan was to live off the fruits of the island until later in the year. They had made a deal with some friends to bring supplies to the island, which they would exchange for a crop of marijuana they intended to grow. When they arrived at Palmyra, they were unhappy to see a handful of visitors at the dock area. They had hoped they would have the island to themselves. When they came ashore, they were greeted by a welcoming committee. It wasn't at all what they had expected. They introduced themselves as Stephanie Stearns and Roy Allen, even though the name Buck was tattooed on his right arm in plain view.
What's your name? Roy Allen. Roy? Yeah, that's your name. Roy, you got Buck on your on the side there.
When one of the yachtsmen commented on it, Stephanie claimed that Buck was his nickname. Something about Roy was different from the other yachters. He seemed rougher, perhaps even a little dangerous. Shortly after Roy and Stephanie arrived, another boat appeared in the channel, a beautiful 38-foot ketch called the Sea Wind. It wasn't long before the new arrivals made their way over to the dock. Mac Graham was 53 years old. His wife, Eleanor, nicknamed Muff, was a few years younger. Like Roy, they were surprised to find so many people on what was supposed to be an uninhabited island where they planned to spend the better part of the year.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm Mac. Yeah. Hey, Mac, you got any cigarettes? Sure.
When Roy noticed Mac was a smoker, he asked for a cigarette and took most of the pack. This gesture would be considered impolite anywhere, but on an island, it was particularly so, as supplies are limited and can't easily be replaced. For Mac and the others, this was their first insight into the kind of person Roy Allen might be. Roy also boasted about his plans to raise marijuana and trade it for supplies. Soon everyone began settling into their new life in paradise. Mac Graham began to explore the island, the ruins of the Navy base and the sandy shores.
CQ, CQDA.
And he also made sure to keep in touch with the outside world by shortwave radio.
Everything's fine out here.
At regularly scheduled times, Mac would contact his friend Kurt Shoemaker in Hawaii and tell him about his latest discoveries.
Irisque H6IHG, Hawaii Island, calling and listening. He's just like, Tom Sawyer out in the, on the Mississippi or something. And so he would explain what he did each day. He'd go on excursions, just him, with his machete through the jungle and exploring all the things down there.
For Roy and Stephanie, on the other hand, things weren't going quite as well. Roy found the island was not well suited for growing marijuana. Living aboard the Iola was difficult. The boat was small, damp, cluttered, and cramped. Their supplies were all but gone, and they began to barter their possessions with the owners of the other boats for food and supplies. To the Grahams and the others, Roy and Stephanie were a nuisance. They were not properly supplied to be out on the high seas this far from civilization. The other yachters had enough supplies for themselves, with some extra for emergencies, but not enough to supply Roy and Stephanie. The Grahams were known for their hospitality. They had invited the other visitors to Palmyra aboard the Seawind. Others warned them not to allow Roy and Stephanie on their boat. But Mac wanted to make an attempt at being cordial. On July 5th, 2 weeks after the Grahams arrived, and long after everyone else on the island had already had the tour of the Seawind, Roy and Stephanie received an invitation to visit. They eagerly accepted.
Oh, the Seawind was a real yacht. You know, it was a beautiful-looking boat to begin with, and nice lines. And Mac had kept it in just perfect shape.
Anywhere we want to go in the world. It's gorgeous, huh? That's
The Seawind was everything the Iola was not. It had a fully stocked larder, and it was equipped with every high-tech navigational device on the market. It had plenty of room, and the Seawind had sailed around the world. Stephanie commented on its size and human comforts. She was enchanted by the big bunk in the forward cabin. Roy remained sullen. When Roy began to find the cramped quarters and damp bedding of the Iola too confining, he decided to move into a makeshift tent on the beach. Stephanie would stay aboard the boat. By now, Roy and Stephanie had bartered most of their possessions with the other yachters for food and supplies. Other than trading or flat-out begging, they had little to do with the others. The situation was getting worse by the day. Most of the marijuana seedlings they had counted on for money had been eaten by insects. Although Palmyra has abundant natural resources, including fish, crabs, bird eggs, and coconuts, Roy had little knowledge of how to survive off the land. To catch fish, he would shoot them with his .22 caliber revolver. Like clockwork, Mac continued his weekly radio conversations with Kurt, and he kept him informed about Roy and Stephanie.
Okay.
They had moved way down the end of the lagoon and would have nothing to do with the other group. And bizarre things like they started planting marijuana again to see if they could grow it. He needed, I think they were running low on food, so he needed coconuts. Took a chainsaw and cut a coconut tree down to get to the coconuts. That's kind of stupid.
It also infuriated Mac Graham. Mac loved the island and had no tolerance for Roy's destructive
What's your
ways.
problem? You don't have to do that to get one of these. Why don't you just climb up and get it down?
One day he confronted Roy about it.
I'd ask you for
Roy
your
quickly
opinion
became angry and told Mac to mind his own business. The hostility between them was building. On July 13th, Muff Graham wrote her mother a letter. She hadn't been enthusiastic about living on an island in the first place, and having Roy and Stephanie there only added to her misgivings. Dearest Mother, 3 boats are here now, but one is leaving and will take this letter with them. That leaves us alone with the hippie couple who plan to stay here and live off the land. It's just our luck they decided to roost in Palmyra. Roy and Stephanie have run out of sugar, cigarettes, and I don't know what. They've bartered with other boats. Next they will ask us. Muff sent the letter back to civilization with Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who were leaving Palmyra after a brief stay. The Grahams had previously made arrangements to receive letters over the radio from Kurt Shoemaker, who read them to Mac during their regular weekly shortwave contacts.
During that period of time, I was receiving mail from both of their mothers, his mother and hers. And then I would read this to them. Well, as one of the boats down there would leave, they would take the mail with them and eventually mail it back in Honolulu or wherever. So there was communication going back and forth. And an interesting thing about it is one of the letters I read, the mother, and I think she was in her 80s, she says that she was afraid for them. She says, you should leave that place. Something will happen to you.
One day when Mac was talking to Kurt, he told him that Roy had sent a message with one of the yachts back to his friends in Hawaii. They were supposed to bring Roy and Stephanie's supplies to Palmyra, and he told his friends to reply through Kurt's shortwave radio. Mac asked him if he had heard any news from them. But Kurt had heard nothing, and when Mac talked to him about Roy and Stephanie, There was something about their description that worried him.
And in between these conversations, he'd occasionally mention the other boat. And I told him, I said, that doesn't sound too good to these people. I said, you better be careful. And he said, no, I can take care of myself. I'll be all right. And so I said, well, I don't know. I think you ought to get out of there myself, or one of you ought to leave.
I don't want to hear it.
No, I don't care.
Roy and Stephanie's tempers were running short.
That's why. Look around you.
During the first weeks of August, the sound of angry voices could frequently be heard across the lagoon.
I don't want to hear anything.
The other visitors to the island saw Roy as a violent and quick-tempered man who was dangerous and should be avoided. Then, midway through August, another boat came to Palmyra and spent a few days. Norman Sanders and Thomas Wolfe were on their way to Samoa. The night before they were set to leave, they had cocktails with Mac and Muff. The talk turned to the Iola. Sanders was a sailing expert. He told them he had offered Roy advice about getting the Iola to Samoa. He said he'd suggested Roy and Stephanie should go there, but Roy had just become angry and refused the help. Wolfe cautioned the Grahams that it would be easy for an unsuspecting couple to disappear on a place like Palmyra. In response, Mac opened a drawer and pulled out a .357 Magnum. He assured the others that he could take care of himself. "I'm tougher than he is," Mac said confidently. Wolfe and Sanders left Palmyra the next day.
The group of people that were down there, the various boats, one by one, of course, were on their way somewhere, and they one after another left.
Visitors had come and gone pretty regularly for the last 2 months, but with the departure of Wolfe and Sanders on August 17th, things changed. This was the end of the season when most sailors would be stopping by Palmyra. Mac and Muff Graham were alone on the island, with Stephanie and Roy. On August 27th, Mac talked to Kurt Shoemaker. Roy and Stephanie and the Grahams had been alone on Palmyra for 10 days. The tension between Mac and Muff Graham and Roy and Stephanie had increased. Muff knew Roy had a gun and a chainsaw, and at one point he'd been seen with an acetylene torch. This scared her, and she wanted off Palmyra, but Mac stubbornly didn't want to leave. The boats had moved to opposite sides of the lagoon, and the couples pretty much ignored each other. But then, something unusual happened.
Here is KH6IHG. I was talking to him, and while we're talking, he hears a female voice yelling, saying, calling to him. And he says, "Oh, what's this company?" So he says, "Hang on a minute, I'll go topside and see." And he says, "I'll be darned. She's coming over in her dinghy, and she says she has a cake for him." And he says, "I guess they're going to declare a truce or something." Huh? That was the words he used. He says, "I better check this out carefully." I said, "Okay." So same schedule next week, same time. So I said, "Be careful now, and see you later." Was it?
1 week later, Shoemaker was at his radio for their regularly scheduled conversation. For the first time since Mac and Muff had left Hawaii, there was no response from the sea wind.
I was concerned about that, and I tried for quite a while, about 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to make contact. So the next contact was a couple of days later, and then I tried again, nothing. And then for the next few weeks, I tried, intermittently from time to time. And then it was at that point that I decided something happened.
Unable to convince the authorities that something had gone wrong on Palmyra, Shoemaker had a friend fly over the island. The aerial survey seemed to confirm his worst fears. Palmyra was deserted. There were no boats in the harbor, no Iola, no sea wind, and there was no sign of life.
Well, I had a feeling that all that time that something had happened. The boat had been taken over. I was very strong feelings about that, simply because of all of the incidents that they related to me and he related. And I mean, it just pointed to that one thing, but I couldn't convince anyone that that was a problem.
Shoemaker did have one resource available to him, the radio. Having no idea where they had gone, he spread the word to yachtsmen in the Pacific to be on the lookout for the sea wind. But days, weeks, and then months passed with no word about the fate of Mac and Muff Graham or the sea wind. 2 months after the last communication with the Grahams, Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who had been given the last written message from the Grahams, were at the Ala Wai Yacht Harbor in Hawaii. Bernard noticed a 38-foot ketch with very distinctive lines.
Yes, it is. Yes, it
Well,
is.
then it had to.
It had been repainted, but Bernard was certain it was the Sea Wind. He also recognized a familiar figure on deck, Roy Allen. Knowing the tensions that had existed between the Grahams and Roy and Stephanie, and also knowing that the Grahams had not been heard from in some time, Leonard immediately called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had been aware of the missing Sea Wind.
Yes,
When Leonard explained that the owners were not on the boat, the Coast Guard officers felt this might lead to something outside of their jurisdiction. They called the FBI. The call was answered by Special Agent Calvin Shishido, who worked out of the FBI's Hawaii field office.
My assignment there was just a general mix of general criminal investigations, security investigations, backgrounds. It was such a small office that we couldn't specialize. We had to handle everything that came at us.
I don't know.
Shishido agreed to meet the Coast Guard and the Leonards at the marina, although what he heard was not conclusive enough to warrant FBI involvement. Perhaps the owners were on shore, or perhaps they had sold the boat. Perhaps it wasn't even the Sea Wind. After arriving moments later, the Leonards showed him the yacht in question. There seemed to be no one aboard.
So he pointed out the areas where there was an attempt to disguise the boat. You know, it had been repainted, the gunnels had been repainted, the nameplate was taken off, it was removed and painted over. And other things that he pointed out to show that it was actually the Sea Wind. He knew it was the Sea Wind.
Although there was still no direct evidence of foul play, Shishido was growing suspicious. There was no visible activity on the boat, so Shishido instructed the Coast Guard officers to post a lookout. The lookout spotted Roy and Stephanie the next morning, rowing from the floating dock towards shore in a little dinghy. He immediately alerted the Coast Guard, who in turn called Special Agent Shishido. But another boat owner hailed Stephanie and Roy and told them that the Coast Guard had been looking around their boat the day before. Roy noticed a Coast Guard patrol boat in the marina that seemed to be moving towards them. Roy quickly changed direction and headed for the nearest dock. After letting Roy off, Stephanie started to row back to the Sea Wind. Two plainclothes policemen were approaching Roy when he spotted them. Without hesitating, he turned and dove off the end of the dock and began to swim away. The officers found a wallet on the dock.
And in it was the identification of this Roy Allen, and it had a photograph. And I believe Mr. Leonard looked at the picture and said that was Roy Allen.
Meanwhile, the Coast Guard boat had spotted Stephanie in the rowboat and began to give chase. She turned and started to row towards shore, hoping to reach the dock before they caught up with her. When she reached the dock, she jumped out and began to run, but there was nowhere for her to go. The patrol boat was right behind, with Bernard Leonard aboard. He and a Coast Guardsman followed her. They saw her dart into a hotel stairwell. They found her hiding behind a potted palm. She immediately recognized Leonard from Palmyra.
Come with us.
As the Coast Guard officer took her into custody, one question was foremost on Leonard's mind. What had happened to the Grahams? Stephanie Stearns was taken to the Coast Guard offices for questioning. On the way there, Bernard, Leonard, and Stephanie found themselves alone in the rowboat. When he asked if Mac and Muff were still alive, she shook her head. Mac and Muff, she told him, had apparently drowned. At least, they never found their bodies. Leonard was incredulous. How could that have happened? Stephanie explained that she and Roy had been invited to the Sea Wind for dinner, but the Grahams never showed up. The next morning, she and Roy found the Grahams' overturned inflatable Zodiac boat washed up on shore in the shark-infested lagoon. After searching fruitlessly for the bodies, they decided to take their own boat back to Hawaii, but it got hung up on the reef, so they went back and took the abandoned Sea Wind. Leonard listened to Stephanie, but he didn't believe her story.
As I remember it, I was
In the Coast Guard offices, she started telling her story again, this time to Special Agent Shishido and the Coast Guard.
At a time. Okay.
This is the way it happened. This is the way I'm telling it to you.
Details then of what happened to them.
At one point, I remember speaking to her. She kept going on, and I kept reminding her that she had the right to remain silent and that anything she said could be used against her in a court of law. And she would just keep on talking.
Stephanie told them she had arrived at the Seawind with Roy just about in time for dinner. The boat was strangely quiet. They called out, but no one answered.
Hello? Hello? Matt? Mom? Hello?
They went below and continued their search, but got no reply.
I can't find anybody down here.
They're not here?
Didn't she say they were going to meet us here?
Yeah, they knew we were coming for dinner.
They assumed the Grahams had gone out fishing for dinner and made themselves at home till they returned.
There's nobody here.
According to Stephanie, the Grahams never showed up, so they both decided to spend the night on the Seawind.
All right.
They believed the Grahams would show up any time. But the next morning, when the Grahams hadn't returned, she said they became very worried and went out to look for Muff and Mac as soon as it was light. But all they found was the Grahams' overturned Zodiac washed up on shore and a can full of gasoline. They turned the inflated boat over and started the motor. Then she said they spent the next 2 days searching for the Grahams or any sign of what might have happened to them. But they found nothing. The Grahams had simply vanished. Shishido found her story implausible.
Together, and we went over there.
When she explained how they had taken possession of the Seawind, her story was quite different from the one she had just told Leonard.
No one would have believed us. They would have taken
This time she said they had left Palmyra aboard the Seawind towing the Iola, which got caught up on a reef and sank.
And all we found
Stephanie was tripping over her first lie.
But I knew there were at least, two conflicting stories as to how they got in possession of the boat. At this point, we became very worried about the Graham's condition. We didn't know what had happened to them, and we certainly, was not going to get any real, true information from Stephanie Stearns.
But
the FBI has jurisdiction over crime on the high seas. Shishido determined he had enough evidence to arrest Stephanie Stearns for interstate transportation of stolen property. Then his attention turned to Stephanie's boyfriend, Roy Allen, who had evaded the police at the marina and was still at large. Shishido checked, and there was no record of a Roy Allen, but he had the wallet with Roy Allen's picture. Bernard Leonard also told Shishido that Roy had taken marijuana plants to Palmyra and had intended to grow them to sell. Drugs and a photograph of Roy gave him a starting place.
But I suspected that people with, traveling on the Iola, which is not really a seaworthy boat, going around and planting marijuana on the islands and so on, must be involved in drug running.
Hi, Cal. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. What can I do for you today?
Shishido took the photograph to the Drug Enforcement Agency and showed it to several of the agents.
So we would like to get further information on here.
They were surprised when they looked at the picture.
Let me get into it.
They told him that it was Buck Walker and that they had been looking for him.
I'll get back to you on that. Have a good day. All right.
And so we got all the background data on Buck Walker, and that's when our search for Buck Walker began. And that now we're looking for Buck Walker instead of Roy Allen.
Buck Dwayne Walker was a convicted felon and a fugitive. He had been awaiting sentencing on a drug conviction when he and Stephanie fled Hawaii on the Iola headed for Palmyra. As the search for Walker began with a new urgency, Shishido was also concerned about the Grahams. He knew Stephanie was lying and changing details about what had happened on Palmyra. He didn't trust her story about the fate of the Grahams. There was always the possibility that the Grahams were alive and stranded on the island. Shishido made arrangements for himself and some other agents to travel to Palmyra to see if they could find them.
We decided to go to Palmyra to see if maybe the Grahams were stranded there, in need of food, and or they could have been tied up for all we know, and immobile, and their lives were in danger. So we decided to go out there to look around, and we did.
On the island, they found the remains of the camp Buck Walker had abandoned. They took photographs and examined the site thoroughly. A search of the island produced no sign of the Grahams. However, Shishido did make a couple of curious discoveries.
I remember picking up a hatch cover, and of course, later it was identified as a hatch cover coming off of the Iola.
The hatch cover was important because no seaman would leave for high waters without his hatch cover. Without it, the boat could take on water, which would cause it to sink. This told Shishido that Roy and Stephanie had intended to scuttle the Iola. Using these clues, Shishido began to develop his theory as to what happened to the Grahams.
My thinking was that they had tied the couple up and put them on the Iola and sank the Iola. And that was the only explanation we had because we couldn't find the Iola, and there was no way the Iola could be in Hawaii because they certainly wouldn't be sailing the Seawind and the Iola by themselves.
Shishido found something at an old Navy warehouse that piqued his interest.
I think one of the things, too, that I noticed was that in an old workshop or warehouse, there was an old air rescue boat or sea rescue boat, and it had place for 3 containers where they put provisions. And of the 3, 2 receptacle areas were, the cans were missing, and the third was still left there. And of course, now we're looking for 2 people. In my mind, suspiciously thought that these 2 cans, because it was large enough that they could have been, containing the remains of the couple.
Meanwhile, the search for Buck Walker continued. On November 8, 1974, after spending 10 days hiding out on the lava flows on the big island of Hawaii, Buck resurfaced in a tiny hamlet off the beaten track. He rented a room and went to a restaurant for a drink.
Gentlemen, here's your
At
check.
the same moment,
Is there
across
anything
the
else I
street,
can do
2
for you?
uniformed officers were eating lunch. As they paid the bill, they showed their waitress a picture of Buck Walker. She said he'd just been in the restaurant looking for a drink, and she'd sent him to a bar across the street. The officers spotted him and contacted the FBI. Buck was arrested on the fugitive charge. He was read his rights and handcuffed without a struggle.
FBI, you're under arrest. Put your
Under
hands on-
questioning, Buck revealed nothing that could help the investigation. He answered questions with a frank yes or no, or with stone silence. The investigators couldn't find even the slightest piece of information that could help them find the Grahams.
Right arm.
While Stephanie was in prison awaiting trial, Shishido found more proof Stephanie and Buck were lying.
While she was at prison, we found out that she had some photographs developed. So when the photographs were developed and brought back to prison, we seized the photographs and examined them. Among the photographs showed that the Seawind, or Stephanie Stearns, was on the Seawind taking a photograph of the Iola under full sail with Buck Walker on board the Iola. So we knew that at one point Stephanie was on the Seawind and Buck Walker by himself on the Iola.
This
All right,
was
let's
different
go.
than the stories both Buck and Stephanie told officials. Shishido was convinced that the Grahams had been murdered, but without any bodies and no hard evidence, the U.S. attorney assigned to prosecute the case did not believe they could make a homicide charge stand up in court.
We could, but it's strictly circumstantial, and we might not win the case. And if we lose the case, and later, years later, if the body should pop up and we get some real good evidence as to murder on the part of the Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, he said we couldn't try them again. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns were charged with interstate transportation of stolen property. It was an open and shut case. Buck and Stephanie had been caught with possession of the Seawind in Hawaii and had made numerous attempts to change its appearance. Buck had registered it under his name as a homemade boat. Buck and Stephanie were both found guilty. Buck Walker received 10 years for his previous drug conviction and 5 years for theft of the Seawind. Stephanie Stearns received 2 years for her role in the boat theft. But Shishido was still convinced the couple had killed Mac and Muff Graham, and that somewhere on or around Palmyra was the evidence to prove it. He could only hope that someday it might surface, and then he could charge Buck and Stephanie with murder. On January 21, 1981, a young South African couple, Robert and Sharon Jordan, were visiting Palmyra. Almost 7 years had passed since Mac and Muff Graham disappeared. That afternoon, Sharon went for a walk down the beach and made a startling discovery. Washed up on the shore was an aluminum canister, and beside it, she found human bones and a skull. Around one of the bones was a wristwatch. She had heard the story of Mac and Muff Graham and immediately contacted the Coast Guard. Cal Shishido was catching up on paperwork when he overheard part of a phone conversation.
Human bone? Palmyra?
First he heard the words human bones, and then Palmyra. Where's Palmyra? The agent was new and had never heard of the case. Shishido was on his feet immediately. Who was on the phone, he asked. The agent told him it was the Coast Guard. Shishido quickly took the phone and told the Coast Guard to ask the couple who had discovered the bones to stay on the island and wait for them.
When I first heard that, of course, I was really excited because I thought, whoa, somebody found some bones on Palmyra, and it had to be the Grahams. And I thought, this is it.
Shishido and a team of investigators flew to Palmyra to examine the new findings. If the bones Sharon Jordan found belonged to either one of the Grahams, the FBI might be able to establish the cause of death. Shishido was shown the gruesome discovery: a skull, human bones, a wristwatch, and some wire, all lying next to an open metal box, identical to the kind Shishido noticed in the rescue boats on his previous visit to the island. He speculated that the wire had been wrapped around the case and had somehow come loose. Then when the case came ashore, it had opened, and the bones had spilled out. Since a second container had been missing from the Navy rescue boat, Shishido felt the other victim might still be inside. Divers were sent to search the surrounding waters, looking for a container like the one found on the beach. But in the shark-infested waters, the divers found nothing. When Shishido got back to Honolulu, he sent the container, wire, skull, and bones to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. for examination. The skull belonged to a Caucasian woman in her late 40s or early 50s. Dental records showed that it was Muff Graham's. The skull also had signs of charring around the left eye socket and a hole in the left temple. The FBI concluded that the contour of the hole was consistent with a gunshot wound, but due to the age of the wound could not say conclusively that it was caused by a bullet. The aluminum box was examined by the FBI Elemental Analysis Unit. They found evidence of charring on the outside of the box. Next, the FBI needed to determine if the skeleton had been in the box. They cut out a rectangular section and subjected it to a battery of tests. The rectangular piece of metal was found to contain traces of human protein, conclusive proof that the box had once held a body.
The FBI did a tremendous job as far as the container was concerned, because they came back with a report that indicated that there were human remains in the container, that the remains had been burned, and that while it was in flame, the container was in about 2 inches of water. And they found traces of human protein, human fabric in the container and everything, to indicate that a human body was disposed of in the container by flame.
As Shishido had suspected, Muff Graham had not simply drowned. She had been murdered. The FBI now believed it had enough evidence to prosecute Buck and Stephanie for the murder of Muff Graham. Having served her jail term for the theft of the Seawind, Stephanie now had a white-collar job in California. She was arrested and taken into custody. Buck Walker was still serving time in prison, or so Shishido thought.
When I sent our agents in the state of Washington a lead to put a detainer on Buck Walker, I found out that he was an escapee. And I thought, oh no, not again. You know, are we going to have to do this search all over for him? We found that there was only one woman that had visited him, and that she had visited him the day before his escape.
A trace was placed on the woman which led them to her car, parked in a motel in Yuma, Nevada. The FBI was notified and set up a stakeout. When Buck and another man came out of the motel and approached the car, the FBI moved in. He was considered an armed and dangerous fugitive, wanted both for murder and jailbreak. On the front seat of the car, they found barbiturates and several thousands of dollars in cash. Buck Walker was arrested and charged with the murder of Muff Graham. Stephanie Stearns was also arrested and charged with the same crime, though they would be tried separately. Because of the publicity the story had generated in Hawaii, the trials were moved to San Francisco. Both cases were assigned to federal prosecutor Elliot Inoki. The motive for the crime was never in doubt.
The motive was they were without a seaworthy vessel. The only other couple on the island was leaving shortly. they were running out of food, and they didn't know when any other vessel would get there, if at all, because this was becoming the end of the so-called season when you could expect people to visit the island. So you had people running out of food and provisions with an inability to get anywhere.
Inoki knew he could show Buck and Stephanie had opportunity and motive to kill the Grahams. But first he had to prove in court that Muff Graham was murdered. He also needed to completely discredit Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams had drowned. As Inoki began constructing his theory of the case, Shishida was busy putting holes in Buck and Stephanie's defense. The FBI had already found evidence of human protein on the sides of the aluminum box, but since the bones were found next to it, Inoki wanted additional proof that the body had actually been in the box. Therefore, ruling out the possibility of Muff drowning as Buck and Stephanie had claimed, he contacted San Francisco's chief medical examiner, Boyd Stevens.
Finding the skeleton together is supportive that Miss Graham was in that box and therefore held together. It's not possible for me to really say that she couldn't have stayed together if she had been out of the box. However, the problems that would be required is that the skeleton has to stay together even after it's disarticulated. And that's an extremely strong argument that could not have occurred if she had died and just been laying on the lagoon bottom. The second is that the skeleton has to come ashore together, and that's just not really possible.
Shishida also decided to test Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams' dinghy, the Zodiac, had been found overturned.
Of course, later investigation showed that if the boat had capsized the way they said they found it, the outboard motor would have been inoperable because of the salt water going into the engine itself. And of course, we made a test to find out whether the Zodiac could actually tip over accidentally, and we tried to force it to turn upside down, banging into things with 3 or 4 men sitting on one edge of the boat, and it just wouldn't tip over.
Inoki also asked medical examiner Boyd Stevens to examine Muff Graham's skull in order to corroborate the FBI's findings that Muff had been murdered. Inoki knew that having 2 highly respected sources would strengthen his case. Stevens found flat abrasions to the skull, consistent with prolonged confinement in a box, such as the aluminum container.
The key issues for us was the flattening of the skull, which represents that it had been placed against a hard, flat surface, primarily across the left side of the face. And what I'm pointing to is the nose, the eye sockets, and what would be the cheek and life, and of course the teeth. One of the things that was evident about the skull of Miss Graham is that this whole area about the face had been planed down so that it was a flat surface. And if you can imagine, if I take this skull and put it across a flat surface, and let's just say this table is coated with sandpaper, and I work it back and forth for a period of time, eventually I would shave it down until it was a flat surface. There was a second plane showing that the skull had changed position and again had been exposed to a flat surface with motion for a long period of time. We used that as an argument that the skull had been within the box and moving. If the body had been buried in the coral sand, then it would not be a change that we would expect to see. And coffin wear is not seen if somebody's buried in dirt or in coral. It's seen if they're in a hard surface container.
There were minimal animal bite marks and insects on the skull, which were consistent with remains that had only been exposed to the surface life for a short period of time, presumably the time after the box had surfaced and opened. But what about the charring on the skull and the metal box? Did this show an attempt to destroy the body?
One of the questions we had been asked is whether we could prove that the skull had been burned with an acetylene torch.
People who were at Palmyra when Buck and Stephanie were there saw Buck with an acetylene torch. The FBI believed this is what caused the burns to the skull. If Inoki could have Stevens corroborate this, he could further implicate Walker.
If a person is exposed to a flame, there may be burning of the outer portions of the skin, but until the water is evaporated, the tissue can't burn. And it takes a heat period to boil the water off or evaporate it before the tissue can actually burn. Acetylene torches, of course, run fairly hot, and they would do that process fairly rapidly.
The marks on the skull clearly showed the use of an extreme source of heat. further evidence that Muff had been murdered. The forensic evidence overwhelmingly proved that Muff Graham had been murdered. A trial date was set. A trial involving people who live on the high seas presents some unique challenges. The FBI had to subpoena about 40 witnesses and then make sure they were in San Francisco at the time of the trial. Special Agent Hal Marshall was assigned to the case.
I first became involved when I transferred to Honolulu in 1981 from Los Angeles. Witnesses were flying in from all over the world, literally. Sharon Jordan and her husband and 2 children came in twice from South Africa. And one of the hard situations was a lot of these people were boating people who did not keep in touch. Last we heard of some of them, they were in a bay in Hawaii in a boat with no fixed address. So it was a matter of getting them to San Francisco, sometime having to wait 2 or 3 days, sometime postponing it, weather conditions and things like that required us to be sure they were there when we needed them. And luckily, everybody showed up that needed to show up, and everything went smooth.
There were only 2 possible suspects, and Buck had an extensive criminal record. But did Buck commit the murder alone, or was Stephanie also involved? She was the last person known to have contact with the Grahams on the day she brought them a cake. Elliot and Oki believed Stephanie had one strong advantage on her side.
Well, she had one option. She could blame Walker. And although she didn't directly do that, her attorney certainly did in the way the case was argued and presented. That gave her a very big option that Walker simply did not have, or if he had, it was a much more difficult sell because of the circumstances and the personalities involved. He's the one with the prior record, much bigger than she is. The testimony about him shooting fish with his gun. I mean, he had a lot of things on his side of the ledger that were not on her side of the ledger. One of the other substantial differences is that Stephanie testified in the case. Walker did not, and so she directly refuted any claim of knowledge or involvement in any kind of homicide. But certainly, through her testimony, left a large room for her attorney to argue that Mr. Walker had the opportunity and the means to commit a murder.
A jury found Buck Walker guilty after only a few hours of deliberations, and he received a sentence of life in prison. Stephanie Stearns was defended by famed attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who was convinced of her innocence. She was acquitted of all charges when he convinced a jury that Buck not only acted alone, but sought to conceal the crime from his girlfriend. We may never know what really happened on Palmyra on that day in late August, though the forensic evidence paints a grisly picture.
Well, empirically, I believe that Miss Graham was killed exactly as the charge was made, and that is that she was shot, that there was an attempt to burn her body, that her extremities were probably fractured to get her into the box, and that she was cast into the ocean and then eventually came adrift. And I think that probably happened to the husband as well.
Mac Graham's body has never been found, although investigators believe there's a very high likelihood that he's in the other box.
Every family has eccentrics, even crime families. Crime boss Vincent Gigante, head of New York's Genovese family, was undoubtedly eccentric. The question remained, was he truly mad? Justice rested on the answer. Outwardly, he roamed the streets as a doggedly old man, barely in touch with reality. But in the eyes of the law, he was a cunning conspirator and responsible for murder. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Organized crime takes a concerted effort to crack. The FBI is devoted to cracking it. The case against Gigante hinged on his ability to stand trial. Was his strange behavior an act of madness or a stroke of genius?
Anyone who witnessed Gigante's ravings would have found it hard to believe that he controlled the largest and most profitable family in the New York Mafia, an organization with a long and bloody history. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to 13th century feudal Sicilian society. Bands of Sicilian families organized themselves to rebel against the oppressive and ruthless French invaders. Mafia, the acronym for the Italian Morte alla Francia Italia Anela, which translates to death to the French is Italy's cry, became the name that these organized families used to refer to themselves, its meaning synonymous with men of honor. By the 19th century, the mafia re-emerged in Sicily as a purely criminal culture, mostly hiring themselves out to wealthy landowners to oppress upstart peasants. More and more, the goal of the mafia became focused on how to generate illegal profits. The tradition continued as waves of Italians emigrated to New York in the 1920s. Most immigrants lived in cramped and poor conditions. As a result of growing ethnic tensions, Sicilian Americans became the target of growing resentment. They needed mafia protection more and more. Louis Scilero, a third-generation Italian-American, is head of the FBI's New York field office. A 23-year veteran, he is an expert on the mafia and its intricate structure.
When they first became prevalent in New York City, it primarily victimized members of the immigrant community, where in lower Manhattan they became the victims of extortions and protection rackets. And that's how the Cosa Nostra families originally got their start.
With Prohibition, influence of the crime families grew out from the isolated neighborhoods and began to spread nationwide. A new form of underworld cooperation emerged. Various crime families across America banded together to supply illegal alcohol to a country willing to pay for it.
And I think that probably more than anything gave the Italian gangs, the Italian Cosa Nostra families, a foothold in American society, not only from an organizational standpoint, but certainly from a financial base. Since Prohibition, certainly they then expanded into other areas.
Operating outside the law meant the mafia had to police itself. For an organization animated by self-interest and greed, there would always be conflict and opposition. An elite group of killers were organized to enforce mafia rules, thereby ensuring its survival. This group of mob enforcers came to be known as Murder, Inc. By the early 1940s, Murder, Inc. would be responsible for hundreds of mob-related murders nationwide. The powerful New York bosses during the mafia's early years, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, set up a ruling body for the mafia, responsible for delegating territories and duties among the various gangs nationwide. Home for America's 5 largest families, New York remained the center of the mafia's expanding foothold in America. It remains so to this day.
The 5 New York families consist currently of the Gambino family, the Bonanno, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Genovese family. Each of those families are also members of the Commission and also have their base in New York City.
The Commission, composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families, acts as a criminal board of directors, settling disputes between families and making major decisions on mafia business. Each family is governed by its administration, comprised of the boss, the underboss, and the consigliere, or counselor, who are responsible for directing their family's criminal activity. Below the administration in the family hierarchy are the captains. The captains are the leaders of crews of soldiers, the men responsible for carrying out the day-to-day criminal activity. To become a soldier, properly known as a wise guy or good fella, an individual has to first be made or officially inducted into the secret society. He must blindly obey the rules of Cosa Nostra, Italian for this thing of ours. He is sworn to put the family ahead of all else. If he is asked to kill, he must faithfully do so. It was against this backdrop, a bustling immigrant community with an expanding Cosa Nostra influence, that Vincent Giganti grew up. His parents came from Naples and settled in lower Manhattan. Vincent finished 8th grade and started trade school, but soon dropped out. Less than a decade later, Giganti became a wise guy in the Genovese crime family. Vincent Giganti's crime career spanned a turbulent time in American mafia history. The mob had expanded its reach into legitimate businesses, the various families fighting to control them. And in the ensuing turf wars, violence was often the final arbiter. The family that Giganti attached himself to was steeped in Cosa Nostra's American origins. The infamous Charles Lucky Luciano, responsible for organizing and structuring the American mafia, was the family's first boss until he was imprisoned in 1936. As a result, Luciano's family administration, Frank Costello, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Vito Genovese, fought for control of the family. Costello won out, but Vito Genovese began plotting his takeover. A young Vincent Gigante first gained notoriety as a mobster in 1957 when he attempted to murder Frank Costello. Within the mafia, it was widely believed that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit to get rid of his rival. Gigante's bullet only grazed Costello's head, but apparently Costello got the message. Soon after the shooting, he put out word that he was retiring. Vito Genovese was now the boss of the family that would take his name. Gigante was arrested for attempted murder and brought to trial, but the case was dismissed for lack of a witness. The location and angle of Costello's wound indicated he probably saw the would-be assassin, but at the trial, he failed to identify Gigante as the shooter. Even for an ousted boss, the oath of secrecy remained sacred. Gigante continued to make money for the Genovese family through illegal enterprises. 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, he was arrested and convicted of narcotics violations. He received a 7-year sentence. Convicted mobsters are expected to do their time and remain silent. If Gigante served his time and kept his mouth shut, he would be rewarded after his release. It was up to Gigante to figure out how to avoid future arrests. He was a model prisoner, neat, polite, and willing to take on any job. Gigante's cooperation was so impressive that some prison officials wrote glowing reports. He was released early from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg for good behavior when he was 35 years old. Gigante now devised a secret plan that he hoped would prevent his return to prison forever. He didn't want to leave his mafia life or give up his shot at becoming the boss of the family. After his release in 1964, Gigante's public behavior began to grow bizarre. He became a frequent sight on the streets of Greenwich Village. Gigante could be found wandering the neighborhood, appearing disoriented and mentally unstable. Not long after he left prison, Gigante learned of a police investigation over his association with known mobsters. In 1969, he was indicted for attempting to bribe New Jersey police officers. Allegedly, he offered them money in exchange for information about surveillance and ongoing investigations in the Genovese family. Now, at almost 40 years old, he returned to his mental disability as a foil and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for the first time. To support his story, Gigante and his relatives began to revise his medical history. While Gigante was at Lewisburg, his mother had been required to fill out a detailed family history. She said Vincent was a healthy, happy child. She noted only a speech impediment and a slight heart murmur. He had been a boxer, but never had a serious injury. By the time of the 1969 indictment, however, Gigante's lawyers claimed he was not competent to stand trial. His family suddenly remembered a host of mental problems. He had been given to severe temper tantrums. He had a phobia for the dark. He had been truant from school. He was at one time obese and had learning problems. The incompetency argument worked. Gigante never stood trial for the 1969 bribery charges. That same year, Gigante's boss, Vito Genovese, died of heart failure while serving a prison sentence for narcotics trafficking. In the decade that followed, the Genovese family was so secretive that for law enforcement, it was difficult to tell exactly who the boss was. Even had the FBI been able to identify the Genovese family leadership, making a case against them was another story. Witnesses were hard to come by. Mobsters who violated the sacred oath faced certain death. The best the FBI could do was to go after individual crimes. There were no laws that focused on bringing down the entire criminal family. As Gigante was moving up in the family, the federal government was about to make the FBI's job a little easier. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influences and Corrupt Organization Act, better known as the RICO laws.
What the racketeering law allowed us to do was to look at the family as a criminal enterprise and to attack the family as a criminal act. That became much more effective if you look back from the mid-70s to the 80s in terms of actually indicting the entire family and the entire hierarchy of that family.
The RICO laws require that the government prove that mafia families are essentially criminal enterprises. They must show that the crimes committed by the boss and members of his family are committed to either expand the criminal enterprise or to increase a family member's position within that enterprise. To successfully bring down a family, the government has to prove that any one of several criminal acts, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder, has been committed. By 1979, now armed with federal legislation aimed directly at organized crime, the FBI had devoted teams to exclusively focus investigations on the 5 major families. The FBI's Genovese squad finally learned that Vincent Gigante was on a fast track with the family. Special Agent Richard Rudolph had been assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family.
Through informants and other law enforcement agencies were exchanging information, we became aware that Mr. Gigante was an individual with much respect in the Genovese crime family and operated out of an area in Lower Manhattan. Because he was an up-and-coming person with a lot of respect within the family, we began to do some surveillances of Mr. Gigante.
With the FBI continuing to build its arsenal against organized crime, Gigante's cat-and-mouse game intensified. He stepped up his public show of mental disorder. In the late 70s and into the 80s, he was admitted 5 more times for psychiatric treatment. The FBI continued to keep tabs on Gigante. Agents learned that he frequented the Triangle Social Club, a gathering place for Genovese crime figures.
He could be found there almost on a daily basis. He lived in the neighborhood. He was an individual that could be found there in the late afternoons and into the early hours of the morning, and people would come to see him as opposed to him going to see other people.
Though Gigante's association in the Genovese family seemed certain to investigators, Gigante's family and doctors continuously told investigators that he led a very narrow existence. They said his whole world was confined to the block where he lived and the church he attended with his mother. He was barely functional at home and could not care for himself, they said. But with every passing day, the FBI and New York police were seeing a very different Vincent Gigante. In the early 1980s, the Mafia in the Northeast went through a particularly tumultuous time with several killings. Internal disputes within the family resulted in a string of assassinations. The FBI suspected Gigante was responsible for these gangland executions, especially those intended as punishment for breaking Cosa Nostra rules. Gigante was known to be a traditionalist. He wanted the rules obeyed, and when they were broken, retribution was sure to follow. It started with the murder of Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Although Bruno's family was well outside New York, all families answered to the members of the commission. Gigante was upset because Bruno had been assassinated by his own men in a grab for control of the family. A Cosa Nostra rule had been violated. No one can kill a boss unless the commission sanctions it, and they seldom do. It was rumored that Gigante himself launched an investigation into Bruno's murder. Retribution was swift. Less than a month later, Tony Bananas Caponegro, identified as one of Bruno's assassins, was found dead. He had been shot 15 times and stabbed in the back. His body was stuffed in a trunk, and $20 bills were littered around his body, a clear message that he was killed for his greed. On the same day, another body was discovered. This time it was Fred Salerno, dead of gunshot wounds, dumped in a vacant lot. He too had allegedly participated in Bruno's murder. Phil Testa had taken Angelo Bruno's place as boss. His reign was short. Almost a year after Bruno's execution, Testa was blown up entering his own home. Another boss killed without the blessing of the commission. Another avenging act would follow. Rocco Marinucci was next, found dead with fireworks stuffed in his mouth. A gesture designed to show that he was killed for the way in which he had killed Testa. If the Cosa Nostra was to flourish, all of its members had to comply with its rules. There were no exceptions. Gigante was believed to have ordered the murder of one of his own crime family members. Genovese soldier Jerry Papa had murdered 2 Colombo family members without permission. As punishment for his unsanctioned act, he was brutally shot and killed by members of his own criminal family. Had Giganti become the enforcer for the Northeast Cosa Nostra? Informers within the mob told federal agents that all of these killings had been ordered by Giganti. But information given by admitted criminals is always a problem for potential juries. Criminals will say anything if their cooperation can be traded for a reduced prison sentence. The FBI needed more than the words of criminals looking for a deal. Giganti knew this, and he protected himself accordingly. It seemed that Giganti was now the boss. The FBI began a more focused surveillance effort on Giganti. They learned that the Genovese family had also infiltrated several of New York's major industries: the garment trade, trucking, garbage collection, airport cargo handling, and the city's seafood industry. Vincent Giganti was known on the streets as the Chin, an abbreviation of Cinzino, Little Vincent. Fearing FBI surveillance and wiretaps, family members were not allowed to speak his name. They were to refer to him with hand signals, touching their chins to communicate his nickname. Bringing down the Chin was going to take every bit of know-how that the FBI could muster. They were going to have to create their own luck. As a surveillance team member watched one day, a telling crack in the Chin's ruse appeared. The seemingly frail man was being helped across a busy street. When oncoming traffic threatened, he became suddenly animated, racing to safety. His helplessness somehow overtook him again on the other side. Clearly there were two Gigantis, the mentally troubled one displayed to the public, and the determined boss of the Genovese administration. The FBI would soon learn of a third. Giganti's ex-wife and their 5 children lived in New Jersey while he maintained a relationship with his long-standing companion Olympia Esposito. He usually called on her late at night, looking quite dapper before he was aware of the surveillance.
We learned that he frequently visited a townhouse which was located up on 77th Street and the east side of Manhattan, where we later learned that a common law, he was living with his common law wife, and he had been married previously, and this was his second family there at this residence.
Soon the FBI knew all of the Chin's hangouts. This gave surveillance teams an opportunity to observe Giganti without his knowledge. A major break came when NYPD Organized Crime Task Force member Detective Tom Bruno was able to snap photos of some of Giganti's activities.
In 1984, I was assigned to a joint organized crime task force. That task force consisted of FBI agents and New York City police officers, detectives, and we were assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family. Then the next step was to go to Sullivan Street, where Chin Giganti lived. His apartment was above a pet store, alleged pet store. And he also had a social club on the block. And when you'd go by the social club, you'd see numerous people that were in the photos. And you'd see them standing in front of, going inside, and then sometimes crossing the street, going to the pet store, which was where the Chin, we believe, met people. Pet store really never had any kind of business that we could see. It had a little cat box in the window, and basically that was it.
More and more, Giganti was seen acting normally when he was unaware he was being watched.
I see Chin Giganti and I see Andrew Giganti, which is his son, come out of his residence. And I'm just minding my business, walking up the block. Andrew leaves to get in his car, and Chin is standing on the corner, and he wasn't helped out of his building, and he was standing on the corner. Andrew gets in his car, pulls out. As he pulls out, there's a car coming up Sullivan Street. It blows the horn. Chin Giganti yells, "Hey, what are you, in a rush?" As he does this, I come into the lighted area. He looks, sees me, and all of a sudden his head goes down, and he plays the sick point.
Another break followed Detective Bruno's surveillance successes. The FBI managed to rent an apartment close to the townhouse of Giganti's companion, Ms. Esposito. An agent would exit through a back door in the rented apartment building and position himself about 50 feet from Ms. Esposito's townhouse. From there, Miss Esposito and Giganti could be seen from time to time. An agent watched the couple for 4 months between midnight and 2 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Weissman, who later would have to prove Giganti's competency to stand trial, was delighted with the agent's observations.
And lo and behold, when he was inside in a place where he didn't think he was being observed, he did all of the normal things that any of us would do. As a matter of fact, what was unusual about those surveillances was that there was nothing unusual about him. He was normal. He was talking to people. He was counting money. He never wore a shoddy bathrobe. Indeed, the only time he was seen in a bathrobe was, not surprisingly, when he got out of the shower. He would wear a nice, fluffy Brooks Brothers type bathrobe, which was not at all like the bathrobe that he would wear when he was on the street. So it became pretty obvious to the people conducting the surveillance that he was engaging in a concerted effort to give an appearance to the public that was false, that was not the way he behaved in real life.
Investigators continued to watch Gigante's bizarre public behavior. But photos themselves are only a single link in proving criminal activity. Investigators needed hard evidence to corroborate what the photos were suggesting, that Gigante was in fact the boss. One wiretap conversation between Genevieve's crew members gave investigators more proof of Gigante's position in the family. On the tapes, known Genovese members were complaining about the chin. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Stamboulidis reviewed these tapes to help prepare a case against Gigante.
He's constantly nitpicking his men, trying to always, with a million questions, drilling them and questioning them on what they're involved in. He's always looking to get money from them or money from some of the schemes and how he earned, and how much money he would make from the gambling operations at the Triangle Social Club and things like that.
While Gigante micromanaged the internal affairs of his family, the tabloids began calling him the Odd Father.
He would check himself into a hospital once a year for what his colleagues in the mafia sarcastically referred to as tune-ups, so that he would have a paper trail showing that he had some, or giving the impression that he had some mental condition. And with the assistance of people around him and people in his family, he was able to cultivate this paper trail, giving the impression to anyone who looked at the cold medical records that here's someone who, year in, year out, was being treated for some form of mental illness.
Gigante knew how to protect himself, both publicly and privately.
Mr. Gigante was very clever in how he conducted business, and he limited his contacts with members of the family. If there were messages or items to be discussed regarding illegal activities conducted by the Genovese family, there would be messages passed on to people immediately surrounding him. Access to him was very limited. If the other family wanted to meet with him, more than likely they would have to send a message.
Gigante avoided the normal sit-downs or more formal meetings held regularly by other family bosses. He would take meetings when businesses demanded his attention. He and his visitors would stroll the sidewalks through the neighborhood, ensuring that surveillance wiretaps would not pick up any incriminating conversations. The always careful Gigante also suspected Ms. Esposito's phone was tapped, and it was. He never talked business on the phone. He would simply use a payphone or make arrangements to talk elsewhere. The FBI would not be able to use the Chin's own words to make a case against him. Other mobsters were not as smart. Sophisticated bugging operations were allowing the FBI to capture a multitude of other mob business on tape. In early 1985, the Justice Department was bearing down hard on a number of high-level organized crime figures. Most were being charged under the RICO Act. Though RICO had been around since the early 70s, it was only now receiving its first real test. Two of Gigante's men had gotten wind that the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families would soon be arrested. They wondered if the Chin was vulnerable. One commented that if he gets pinched, all those years in the asylum would be for nothing. On February 19th, the arrests of several crime family bosses were made. The next day, Vincent Gigante checked himself into the hospital and stayed a week. He had successfully avoided the indictment against the New York bosses. Among those arrested was Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors never brought him to trial. He was killed before they had the chance. By Cosa Nostra standards, the unsanctioned murders of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were unpardonable. Although John Gotti, a captain in the Gambino family, acted shocked at Castellano's death, it was widely believed that he was responsible. Within 2 weeks of the murders, Gotti had publicly taken over as boss. Vincent Gigante issued a subtle warning to Gotti. Without mentioning names, he told Gotti that the murderer would have to pay. It took 2 years, but in 1987, Gigante acted to avenge the murder of his friend and partner in mob business. Through his counselor, Bobby Manna, and some Lucchese family members, Gigante plotted to have Gotti killed. The planning session at a New Jersey restaurant was bugged, and because it was, the FBI saved John Gotti's life. If agents intercept information of a murder plot, they are required by law to try to prevent the killing. So based on the tape, agents warned Gotti. Acting on the FBI warning, John Gotti changed his plans on the day the murder was to take place. Because he was not where he was expected, the murder plot failed. Gigante, however, did not give up. He asked Vic Amuso, acting boss of the Lucchese family, to supervise another hit. It was up to Amuso and his men to work out the details.
And that was to have Amuso reach out to Al Diarco, one of his trusted men, just as Manna was one of Gigante's trusted men, and have Diarco use his contacts in other parts of the country to acquire a remote-controlled bomb.
But Gotti was arrested and imprisoned before the second plot could be carried out. He's serving a life sentence now for racketeering involving extortion and threats of violence, plus murder, including Castellano's. Meanwhile, the FBI had Chin's men on tape conspiring the murder. As the FBI's investigation into Genovese family operations continued, information about a corrupt construction scheme was coming to light. They learned that for years, much of the Genovese family income came from one segment of the construction industry, the window business. The family had managed to keep its hold on window replacement jobs for all of New York City's public housing projects.
We learned that at that time there was an enormous amount of money being put into refurbishing some of the New York City Housing Authority windows. There was an energy crisis underway, and the timing of this was ideal for the organized crime people to become more active in it. What we learned was that the Genovese family, along with 2 or 3 other families, were becoming involved in companies that were bidding and installing the windows in some of these housing projects. From the late 1970s up until the late 1980s, there was approximately $190 million worth of contracts given out by the city of New York for the window replacement industry.
It was classic mob business and a textbook example of racketeering. The mafia took over an industry to the exclusion of legitimate businesses. Union officials were corrupted, in this case Ironworkers Local 580. Bids were rigged, and companies or workers trying to play by the rules lost out. For years, the Lucchese and Genovese families operated their construction schemes autonomously. By the early 80s, they realized that a partnership would be much more profitable. By this time, the Lucchese family had a firm hold on Local 580, and the Genovese family had corrupted several contractors. They cooperated because it meant more business.
By using the Local 580 as a tool, they were able to exclude several contractors from coming in and bidding on some of these projects, and in essence created somewhat of a monopoly for themselves.
On nearly all city housing authority work, and on much of the new construction for the city, the Genovese contractors and installers paid $2 a window. $1 went to the Lucchese family, 25 cents to the collector, and 75 cents to the boss for the family's role in handling the union. The other $1 went to the crooked union officials who looked the other way as jobs went to non-union workers. Refusal to cooperate often carried a penalty of violence. In the late 80s, a carpenters' union delegate had both of his legs broken by Genovese men for refusing to cooperate, though he maintained that he was unable to get a good look at his attackers. And in 1992, a delegate from Local 580 was shot and killed coming out of his house on Long Island over a disagreement with his Cosa Nostra contracts. The Lucchese and Genovese family arrangement was working very smoothly. That is, until Peter Savino was persuaded to wear a wire. Savino was a Genovese soldier and point man for the window racket.
And we built a case on him, a murder case on him, and it was sufficiently compelling that he realized, like many of these people, that he didn't want to die in jail. So what did he do? He decided to cooperate. And for an 18-month period, made tape recordings of people in the Genovese family and people in the Lucchese family operating this scheme.
Vincent Gigante didn't realize Peter Savino was turning on him. He was happy with Savino's work and satisfied with the window scheme's progression. Savino kept track of the money. He managed the contracts. He supervised the bids. He arranged the payoffs.
With us or not? It looks like everything's going.
The boss was happy, but some Genovese family members began to suspect Savino. When bodies were found in the basement of a building he owned, Genovese members were surprised that he was never seriously investigated by law enforcement.
How much are your people going to cost me?
As a result of that, people speculated, well, Savino wasn't arrested, yet these bodies were found in a building that's tied to him. Maybe he's cooperating, but nobody was really sure.
Savino was a cash cow for Vincent Gigante. He was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Genovese family every month. So when Gigante was told of Savino's betrayal, he chose not to believe it and initially refused to order him killed. Savino continued to wear the wire, trying to get other family members to acknowledge Chin and his position as boss of the family. Gigante's troops, however, could never be persuaded to break the boss's rule about not mentioning his name.
Remember Unifield? Okay. Vincent had said when it came time to bid. Oh, okay, I'll mention her. He had said to go out and bid the work.
It was, don't mention that name. How can you talk like that? That was pretty damning proof. Even though it didn't give you a specific crime, it told you that this was a man to be feared. It was hardly somebody who was incompetent.
Shortly thereafter, it came to Gigante's attention that Savino was in fact cooperating. Furious at this betrayal, Gigante ordered the murder of Peter Savino. By that time, the FBI had relocated Savino well out of Genovese family reach, but not before he supplied agents with thousands of hours of taped conversations.
Mr. Savino was also in a position to provide us with the historical aspects of how the scheme developed, his relationship with the leaders of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime family, and what their participation was in this thing. Mr. Savino also was able to tell us how the various members of all of these families interacted with Local 580, which was used, again, as the tool to make the scheme work.
The FBI was successfully employing the RICO laws to bring down New York's most powerful bosses. As a result, high-ranking family members saw that their only way to avoid long prison terms was to cooperate. Among them were Gambino family underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gigante was finally arrested and charged under the RICO laws with ordering 6 people murdered, conspiring to kill 3 others, and at least 24 counts of racketeering. In short, Gigante was charged with being the boss of the Genovese crime family. But Gigante still had his mental illness history to fall back on.
Mr. Gigante was indicted in May of 1990, and a second indictment was filed against him in June of 1993. The case against Mr. Gigante was unusual, that it spanned several years before it actually went to trial. He eventually went to trial in June of 1997. During that period of time, the issue that was before the courts was that whether he was competent to stand trial or not. That issue was finally resolved in 1996.
7 years after his arrest, a federal district judge declared Vincent Gigante competent to stand trial. Vincent the Chin Gigante was 69 years old when a jury convicted him of conspiring to kill 3 mafia figures, including Gotti and Savino. He was also found guilty of extortion and union payoff conspiracies in the window replacement scheme. But jurors failed to convict him on charges of directly ordering 6 murders. Now that Gigante was convicted, his defense lawyers argued that he was not fit to be sentenced. They claimed he was too old, too frail, and too mentally incompetent to understand the punishment. While awaiting sentencing, Gigante was confined to a prison hospital and examined by several doctors. Gigante was given several PET scans, a procedure that uses a radioactive tracer to measure brain chemistry. A 1991 scan, first read as normal, was later found to be too flawed to use in diagnosis. A 1993 scan did show some abnormalities. But at least one expert, Dr. Jonathan Brody, judged these abnormalities as not consistent with dementia. Dr. Brody is an attending psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital and a professor at New York University's School of Medicine. He also conducts research on schizophrenia.
Mr. Gigante, at the time of the scan, was purportedly taking medication that affects the brain. And because it affects the brain, it affects brain chemistry, and brain chemistry is what a PET scan is all about.
Gigante was taking an antipsychotic medication, and antidepressants, a low-potency tranquilizer, and sleeping pills. So Dr. Brody was skeptical about the PET scan, but had yet to examine the patient.
When the three of us entered the observation room, the examining room where he was then brought, I was struck at first by his appearance, which I said made me think, oh my God, he really is sick. I've missed the boat. He's really very sick. He came in wearing a bathrobe. He was shuffling. He was mumbling. He was making allusions to God.
But as the examination progressed, some of Gigante's actions began to raise doubts.
One of the things that really struck me was that I didn't note at the time, but I noted a few seconds later, was when I put out my hand for him to shake it, he didn't shake it. And that's a very automatic behavior. You put your hand out, your worst enemy can put his hand out to you, and you tend to take it.
How about this link?
When Gigante was asked the names of his children, he didn't know.
No.
When he was asked where he lived, he didn't know.
Who do you think this might be?
And yet, these are things that people tend not to forget. You know, the brain in a dementia tends to work on the process of accounting. The last in, first out. So recent memory tends to be lost, but that's why people who are very demented can often remember very well events from long ago, even if they can't remember recent events. Well, he was not consistent on that. Indeed, he was asked the question about who the President of the United States was, which is a standard question on a psychiatric mental status evaluation. And he scratched his head and he looked perplexed and he said, I should know that. I should know that answer. It's in there somewhere. And some more questions were asked. He said, I really should know that. And then finally he said, Bush, George Bush. And I sat there and thought, oh, he remembered the question. What was striking was not that the answer was incorrect. What was striking was that the question was remembered despite all of the interfering questions.
No.
And there were other red flags. He seemed to understand abstract concepts. Dr. Brody asked Gigante if he was proud of his children.
Now, pride is really quite an abstract notion. And his response was, yes, they're all working. Legitimate jobs. Legitimacy? Well, that wasn't even a question. Legitimate implies yet something else, that he was able to abstract from the question some intent as to what the question was involved with, and awareness of a distinction between legitimacy and illegitimacy. And here was a man who didn't know what month it was. He didn't know if he was in a hospital.
No.
These and other inconsistencies contributed to Dr. Brody's conclusion that Gigante did not suffer from progressive dementia, vascular dementia, or schizophrenia. Guards assigned to watch Gigante during his pre-sentencing hospitalization also found his behavior normal. They testified that he was active around his prison hospital cell and polite to the hospital staff. He did not need help to shower, to groom himself, or to feed himself.
The lawyers all put in affidavits that they couldn't communicate with Vincent Gigante at all. Well, when he was in jail, he managed to speak with the prison counselors. When you sort of talk to the sort of low-level people in jail who have to take care of inmates on a day-to-day basis. It turns out he knew exactly what had happened. He knew he'd been on trial. He knew that Gravano had testified against him and didn't have very nice things to say about him. He knew that his sentencing was upcoming. He knew what the issue was before Judge Weinstein as to that he had to decide that he was competent to be sentenced. It was completely at odds with what his lawyers were telling Judge Weinstein.
Some psychiatrists thought Gigante really was incompetent. Others thought he was faking. 5 months and dozens of tests later, the judge ruled. The judge said, "In short, the defendant's cognitive and emotional capacity and his communication skills are equivalent to other 69-year-old defendants with limited education. No hallucinations interfere with his abilities to participate in sentencing. He understands the fundamentals of criminal substantive law and procedure. He is deliberately feigning mental illness to avoid punishment which he fears. Defendant is competent to be sentenced and to serve an appropriate term in prison." Shaliro described efforts of the FBI and prosecutors as historic and courageous.
This has been a battle that certainly I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and certainly I think agents that will continue that on over the next 5 or 6 years. If the effort could be sustained and the resources maintained, I think we're on the verge of really reducing the effects and the impact of the Cosa Nostra.
To be sure, the government's legal victory in the Gigante case is partial. The jury, after all, failed to convict him of the 6 murder charges. But the goal was complete. Vincent Gigante is in prison now, serving a 12-year sentence for murder, conspiracy, and racketeering, stripped of the terrible power he once wielded.
Hay asesinos sigilosos que matan con una precisión casi clínica. Otros reaccionan por impulsos violentos, dejando su ira en la escena del crimen. Sus comportamientos demuestran quiénes son ellos realmente. En 1987, la brutalidad del triple homicidio de Anchorage puso a prueba incluso a los investigadores más experimentados. Soy Jill Canstrom, exdirector del FBI en Nueva York. Cuando encontraron a Nancy Newman y a sus 2 hijas muertas en su apartamento, la policía necesitó ayuda y llamaron al FBI. Había pistas por todas partes, pero ninguna era concreta. Los agentes sabían que para este caso debían descubrir cómo pensaba el asesino.
Alaska se encuentra en una zona salvaje. Muerte en Alaska, aparentemente aislada del resto del mundo y sus problemas. Sus habitantes están unidos por la belleza de sus paisajes y el respeto mutuo por la naturaleza autosuficiente de la comunidad. Eran casi las 8 de la mañana del domingo del 15 de marzo de 1987.
Sí.
Cheryl y Paul Chapman despertaron con una llamada.
No.
La hermana de Cheryl, Nancy Newman, no llegó al turno de la mañana en el restaurante donde trabajaba. El gerente de turno le contó a Cheryl que el auto de Nancy estaba en el restaurante, pero nadie la había visto. Quizás los Chapman debían ver qué sucedía. Cuando Paul y Cheryl llegaron al apartamento de Nancy, sintieron que algo estaba mal. No había rastro de Nancy. Sus 2 hijas, Melissa, de 8 años, y Angie, de 3 años, no estaban en el lugar. Las tazas de café seguían en el fregadero desde la visita de Cheryl del viernes. Las sobras del desayuno seguían en la mesa. La lata de propinas de Nancy estaba vacía. Y una colilla de cigarrillo distinta a la marca que Nancy fumaba estaba en el cenicero.
¿Nancy? ¡Nancy!
En la habitación de Nancy, Paul descubrió algo terrible. Encontró a Nancy en la cama, golpeada y sin vida. Paul corrió a las otras habitaciones para buscar a las niñas. Para su horror, encontró a Melissa y Angie brutalmente asesinadas.
¡Vamos! ¡Vamos!
¡No!
¡Vamos!
¡Nancy! ¡No! ¡No!
¿Emergencia?
Sí, necesita ayuda, por favor.
¿Cuál es el problema?
Es un homicidio.
¿Dijo un homicidio?
Mi cuñada no fue a trabajar hoy. Nos llamaron a nuestra casa para decirnos y vinimos a ver qué sucedía.
¿Qué sucedió?
La encontré en la cama.
¿Qué dice?
Es horrible. Envíen a alguien, por favor.
Señor, ya enviamos a alguien para allá. No, Dios, por favor.
En minutos, los oficiales de la policía de Anchorage llegaron al apartamento de Newman. Sin alterar la escena del crimen, los oficiales aseguraron el área e intentaron calmar a la consternada familia hasta que llegara la unidad de procesamiento de escena del crimen.
¿Es ella?
Lo que encontraron fue espantoso. Nancy y Melissa Newman parecían haber sido golpeadas y estranguladas. La garganta de Angie Newman tenía un corte tan profundo que casi fue decapitada.
Bien. ¿Hay algo?
Aún nada.
Es una escena.
El oficial Bill Gifford de la policía de Anchorage estaba en la escena.
El impacto de un caso como este es muy frecuente. Es difícil expresarlo en palabras. Estamos acostumbrados a trabajar con casos de homicidios y agresiones graves, y sobre todo creo que la comunidad se vuelve, quizás, no insensible, pero está acostumbrada a este tipo de cosas. Se trata de un asesinato más. Sin embargo, las personas no están preparadas para algo de esta magnitud.
Los asesinatos fueron tan terribles que incluso perturbó a los oficiales experimentados.
Es impactante para el público y también afecta a los investigadores y oficiales que trabajan en el caso porque no están acostumbrados a ver, como lo mencioné, cosas de esa magnitud.
El cuerpo de Nancy Newman estaba sobre su cama con su bata levantada hasta el pecho. Tenía abrasiones en su nariz, mentón y frente, y una de sus rodillas estaba lastimada. Había manchas de sangre al pie de la cama. Y un par de guantes color verde oliva en la cómoda.
Sí, estas son las huellas y... Bill está allá arriba. Estamos...
Bien.
Encontraron a Melissa Newman de espaldas en medio de su habitación. Tenía una funda de almohada ensangrentada bajo su cuello. Otra funda de almohada ataba sus brazos.
0999.
Angie Newman, de 3 años, yacía en una piscina de sangre en el piso de su habitación, rodeada por sus libros favoritos.
Hay una mancha de sangre ahí. Alguien estuvo ahí.
Los patrones de manchas de sangre suelen dar pistas. Las posiciones de la víctima y el asesino. Los movimientos de las víctimas. Y el número de golpes pueden ser reconstruidos por un investigador experimentado.
En este caso en particular, eso nos ayudó a establecer el orden de los sucesos.
Las manchas encontradas en la cama de Nancy Newman sugieren que ella y Melissa fueron arrastradas hasta la habitación de su madre donde fueron agredidas. Las manchas en la alfombra del pasillo indican que Melissa fue llevada a su habitación y asesinada allí. Los oficiales trataron cada lugar como una escena del crimen por separado. Primero determinaron el tipo de evidencia física que podían encontrar y el orden en el cual debían ser procesadas.
¿Cómo vamos?
Muy bien.
Por la terrible naturaleza del crimen y la falta de un sospechoso, los investigadores sabían que cada posible pieza de evidencia sería potencialmente invaluable.
Genial, es grandioso.
El sargento detective Michael Grimes estaba a cargo de la unidad de homicidios, agresiones y robos del Departamento de la Policía de Anchorage.
Sabía que estaría en aquella escena del crimen por horas, horas y horas. Esto es lo que de inmediato identificamos como un caso forense. No desordenaron mucho la escena cuando encontraron los cuerpos. Fuimos afortunados en ese aspecto.
A menudo los investigadores hallan evidencia en áreas comunes de la casa. A veces las fibras y cabellos debajo de las alfombras pueden ayudar a encontrar al sospechoso. Para una cobertura total, los investigadores dividieron cada habitación en cuadrantes y aspiraron cada sección. Para comenzar con la meticulosa tarea, los investigadores primero deben acordonar un área de 1 metro por 1,5 metros en la habitación. El investigador utiliza una aspiradora común con un filtro especial adaptado. A medida que se aspiran los restos del piso, estos viajan por un pequeño tubo hasta un punto de recolección. Allí quedan atrapados en papel de filtro limpio. Una vez que el cuadrante de la habitación ha sido revisado, se retira el filtro y se coloca en un contenedor de evidencias. Algunos cabellos diminutos y fibras se pierden de la escena al aspirar. Por eso se utiliza un láser argón portable, el cual hace que los cabellos y fibras puedan fluorescer al estar expuestas a la luz del láser. Una técnica llamada prueba de luminol también se utilizó para buscar rastros de sangre. Si hay sangre, el aerosol de luminol hará fluorecer la proteína en ella, haciendo que sea visible para los investigadores.
Justo aquí. Toma una foto.
Muy bien, dame espacio.
Analizábamos la escena y buscábamos rastros invisibles o patrones de sangre invisibles y encontramos una muestra luminiscente que pudimos fotografiar. También sabíamos que faltaba un cuchillo de la cocina. Tomamos uno de ellos, del juego de cuchillos, y encontramos que coinciden en longitud y anchura a la muestra de luminol que teníamos. Adelante, revisa el baño.
El aspecto de la escena indicaba que el asesino tomó a las víctimas por sorpresa.
Primero déjame revisar esto antes de que lo empaques. Veamos qué hay adentro.
Al parecer, la rutina matutina de Newman de repente fue interrumpida, quizás indicando que ellas conocían al asesino.
Bien, excelente. Buen trabajo.
Una gran incógnita fue el incentivo. En la escena, Cheryl le dijo a la policía que Nancy no tenía enemigos. Como camarera era popular entre sus colegas y clientes, amigable sin ser insinuante. ¿Y cuál motivo explicaría la ira impuesta sobre las niñas Melissa de 8 años y Angie de 3 años?
¿Se divirtieron?
Sí, nos divertimos.
Un robo era poco probable. Para los investigadores era obvio que el apartamento no había sido saqueado ni desordenado. Los investigadores tuvieron dificultad para encontrar una pista sólida.
Sí, ocurrió de esa forma. Pediremos una...
El detective Bill Reader manejó el caso desde el principio.
La pista inicial se obtuvo de la misma escena al encontrar que la entrada no fue forzada. Eso nos llevó a buscar a personas que tenían acceso al apartamento y que conocían a las víctimas.
De inmediato comenzaron los interrogatorios. Vecinos, familiares y amigos, cualquiera que pudiese tener información.
El trabajo era encontrar a alguien que hubiese visto cualquier cosa inusual, a algún extraño en el área, que hubiese oído algo extraño, que hubiese visto a alguien cargando cosas, cualquier cosa que nos ayudara a enfocarnos en algún sospechoso.
Los miembros de la familia casi siempre son sospechosos al inicio de la investigación. Paul Chapman no era una excepción, aunque no tenía a nadie que respaldara su coartada, la cual era que estuvo solo todo el sábado. Su reacción al descubrir los cuerpos fue claramente de trauma y de pérdida. Los investigadores hablaron con las personas cercanas a la familia y descubrieron que Nancy Newman estaba felizmente casada con John Newman, el padre de sus hijas. Era un sospechoso. Los esposos usualmente lo son, pero John Newman estaba en California, entrenándose como cerrajero cuando ocurrieron los asesinatos.
Otra manera de eliminar a un sospechoso es observar y continuar hablando con ellos. John nunca nos dio una indicación diferente a la de querer la resolución del caso. Estaba muy desconsolado, mostrando las señales que cualquiera mostraría bajo estas circunstancias.
Ya que los Newman vivían en un complejo de varios apartamentos, el detective Grimes sabía que entrevistar a los vecinos en el área cercana sería una tarea difícil.
Era un apartamento de un complejo de varias unidades, ubicado en un área particular del pueblo, que estaba rodeado por unos apartamentos de varias unidades y literalmente estábamos viendo cientos de viviendas en esa zona.
La unida comunidad de Anchorage quedó impactada por la brutalidad de los asesinatos. Los investigadores policiales, sin tener experiencia en crímenes de esta magnitud, se hacían la pregunta más aterradora de todas. ¿Podría ser un asesino en serie? La policía se sentía presionada para trabajar rápido.
¿Qué tipo de persona cometería este crimen? ¿Existía algún significado en la forma en que estas personas fueron asesinadas que pudiese darnos pistas de a quién estábamos buscando? Y de forma inmediata, yo diría que en 1 o 2 días obtuvimos gran ayuda del FBI.
Rápidamente los investigadores se dieron cuenta que necesitaban determinar el tipo de individuo responsable por los asesinatos. Fueron con la unidad de análisis del comportamiento del FBI en Quantico, Virginia. El agente especial Jude Ray recibió la llamada. Como perfilador de la unidad, el trabajo de Ray era asistir a los investigadores en la búsqueda de los peores asesinos de los Estados Unidos. Para hacerlo, Ray debía entender la manera de pensar de los asesinos.
Buscábamos los actos y acciones de los individuos después de lo ocurrido e intentábamos predecir el tipo de personalidad, por así decirlo, de una vista compuesta de qué tipo de ser humano pudo haberlo hecho.
A través de evaluaciones detalladas de las fotos y reportes policiales de la escena del crimen, Ray le suministró a los investigadores una descripción psicológica del asesino.
Es una escena del crimen desorganizada. Hablo de baja autoestima, todo el tipo de cosas que diría sobre este tipo de personas, que ha sido, la sociedad lo ha rechazado a través de los años y ahora es su momento de rechazar a la sociedad.
Ray le dijo a los detectives de Anchorage que este hecho podría repetirse.
Este incidente en particular lo alarmó mucho, en particular por ser 3 víctimas al mismo tiempo que eran niñas, que en mi opinión también dijo, necesitamos trabajar en esto de inmediato porque al parecer esta persona está fuera de control y existe la posibilidad de que lo vuelva a hacer en un futuro no muy lejano.
Gracias a la autopsia, los investigadores descubrieron que Nancy y la niña de 8 años, Melissa Newman, habían sido abusadas sexualmente. Basándose en esta información y las características del crimen, Ray concluyó que este criminal violento podría tener una historia de abusos sexuales. Sería un hombre blanco de entre 20 y 25 años, un fracasado. A raíz de las conclusiones de Ray, los investigadores comenzaron a reducir la lista de posibles sospechosos. Entre ellos estaba un joven que recién se mudaba a pocos metros del apartamento de los Newman. La policía también interrogó a Kirby Anthony, el sobrino de 23 años de John Newman. Anthony tenía una coartada para la mañana del sábado del 14 de marzo, pero el vecino no.
La enorme ira infligida en ellas, que casi decapitó a la niña de 3 años de edad, implica para mí que no hay algo en mi mente que pueda darme un motivo suficiente que explique toda esta ira proveniente de un extraño.
La insistencia de Ray al decir que el asesino conocía a las víctimas hizo que los investigadores desviaran su atención del hombre que vivía cerca. Los vecinos y amigos de los Newman confirmaron que el joven no conocía a Nancy Newman ni a sus hijas.
Ya que hablé sobre la familiaridad, alguien cercano a la familia, alguien que la conocía, alguien que tenía algún tipo de relación con ella, quizás alguien que fue rechazado por ella. De hecho, dijeron que había un sobrino que les venía a la mente.
Mientras los investigadores seguían interrogando a los posibles sospechosos, la cantidad de evidencia recolectada de la escena estaba agotando los límites del Laboratorio de Criminalística Estatal de Alaska. Una vez más, la policía de Anchorage acudió al FBI. La evidencia fue enviada al Laboratorio de Criminalística del FBI en Washington, D.C. El caso fue entregado al experto en cabellos y fibras, Doug Didrek. Didrek comenzó clasificando la evidencia buscando algo que vincule a un sospechoso: cabellos, fibras, partículas de vidrio, tierra, pintura, lo que sea que haya podido trasladarse durante el contacto violento del asesino con sus víctimas.
En total, creo haber revisado entre 300 y 400 objetos recolectados en la escena del crimen de las víctimas, de la eliminación, muestras de distintas personas como sospechosos, familiares o posibles conocidos.
Las fibras son extrañamente difíciles de rastrear, y como nadie sabía qué vestía el asesino durante el homicidio, no había ninguna base para comparar las fibras recolectadas.
La diversidad que existe es infinita. Por eso, cuando un individuo, en un caso en el que, por ejemplo, utilice un tipo de ropa en particular, transfiere material fibroso, el mismo será considerado como evidencia única. A pesar de que quizás haya hecho numerosas prendas del mismo tipo al salir al público, este material se dispersa y es como una gota de aceite en el océano. Solo está allí, pero es difícil de encontrar.
Diferentes fibras, llegando a ser una cantidad de evidencia menor a un dedal, fueron recolectadas en todo el apartamento de Newman. Sin embargo, la experiencia de Didrek en traslado de fibras le permitió reconstruir los movimientos del sospechoso durante el crimen, dándole a los investigadores una imagen más clara de lo que en realidad ocurrió en el apartamento. Mientras el análisis de Didrek progresaba, la policía de Anchorage le pidió a Kirby que los acompañara al departamento de policía para dar una declaración más detallada, comenzaron a saber más sobre su historia. Anthony y su novia se habían mudado de Twin Falls, Idaho, a Anchorage hacía 18 meses. Ambos vivieron en la casa de los Newman por un tiempo, pero se les pidió irse cuando encontraron trabajo en un barco de pesca.
Lo sé, pero no estamos casados.
Él y su novia se separaron mientras trabajaban en el barco luego de que Kirby la acusara de tener una aventura con el capitán.
No, por favor, no.
Sus compañeros lo describían como irracional e inestable después de la ruptura. Se enfrentó con el capitán y fue despedido. Regresó solo a Anchorage el 14 de febrero de 1987. Sin tener otro lugar a donde ir, Anthony tomó un taxi desde el aeropuerto hasta la casa de los Newman. A través de la ayuda continua de Cheryl Chapman, la policía descubrió que John Newman se enfadó al saber que su sobrino había regresado a su casa durante su ausencia. Al mismo tiempo, la situación se volvía cada vez más incómoda para Nancy. Luego de unas semanas, le pidió a Anthony que se fuera. Se mudó con un conocido, Dan Grant. Mientras la investigación se centraba en Kirby y Anthony, el sargento Grimes recordó su primer encuentro con él. El día de los asesinatos, el detective Grimes se tomó la tarea de notificarle a Anthony sobre las muertes.
Le dije que teníamos malas noticias para él, que su tía y sus 2 hijas fueron encontradas muertas temprano en la mañana. Recuerdo que Kirby agarró su cabello y comenzó a llorar lentamente, pero sus ojos estaban secos, no había lágrimas, bien sea porque mentía o no.
La conducta de Anthony no era de luto por un familiar, pero Grimes sabía que el extraño comportamiento de Anthony no justificaría un arresto. Sin embargo, el reporte de la autopsia los hizo sospechar aún más. Los resultados determinaron que los asesinatos ocurrieron entre las 7 de la mañana y las 12 del mediodía del sábado 14 de marzo.
Fuimos capaces de demostrar que los asesinatos ocurrieron temprano en la mañana, luego de que las víctimas se habían despertado. Una de las víctimas había comido cereal, la otra estaba comiendo cereal en ese momento. La madre estaba bebiendo una taza de café.
Establecer la hora de las muertes hizo que la coartada de Anthony fuese irrelevante, la cual era que estuvo en una fiesta hasta el sábado en la mañana. Admitió que bebió, fumó marihuana y consumió cocaína.
¡Den despierta! ¡Vamos, amigo!
Dijo que regresó a la casa que comparte con Dan Grant a las 7 de la mañana y luego volvió a salir alrededor de las 8:45. Mientras tanto, la investigación del agente del FBI Didrek sobre las fibras y el cabello se hacía más complicada.
Uno de los objetos recuperados viene del polvo aspirado. Al menos había polvo aspirado de distintas habitaciones. Esos objetos deben ser analizados y los cabellos deben ser examinados. Creo que fue la cosa más difícil de este caso. Fue identificar cada cabello encontrado en la residencia. Y comúnmente eso no se hace. Realmente hay muchos cabellos con los cuales trabajar. Pero en este caso, hacerlo fue una tarea monumental y laboriosa de todo el equipo.
Cada cabello muestra sus características peculiares bajo un microscopio, haciendo posible rastrear su posible origen.
El hecho de que los cabellos se diferencian en cada persona es evidente cuando amplías estas características unas 250 o 400 veces.
Para examinar las fibras y los cabellos encontrados en la escena, Didrek utilizó 2 microscopios de comparación de alta intensidad, conectados por un puente óptico, uno para los materiales reconocidos y otro para los que faltaba identificar. Ya que Anthony vivió un tiempo con los Newman, era probable encontrar su cabello en el apartamento. Era importante establecer si los rastros de cabellos eran antiguos o recientes. Didrek revisó el contenido de la aspiradora utilizada en la casa de los Newman.
Debido a las grandes cantidades de cabello y elementos encontrados en la bolsa, tuve que examinar la bolsa desde diferentes puntos de vista, es decir, qué material se depositó o aspiró recientemente.
Ya que Kirby Anthony negó haber visitado el apartamento de los Newman recientemente, era fundamental que Didrek determinara la condición de los cabellos.
La condición de la superficie de los cabellos, la condición de las puntas, de las raíces, a menudo indican qué tan largo puede ser el cabello en un ambiente en particular.
Trabajando con las capas de la bolsa de la aspiradora de los Newman, Dietrich encontró algunos de los tipos de cabello que no parecían pertenecer a ninguno de los Newman. Estos cabellos habían sido depositados recientemente. Además del polvo aspirado, vellos púbicos no identificados también se encontraron en las víctimas y en sus habitaciones. Para determinar el significado de estos hallazgos, Dietrich ahora quería saber cómo son usualmente trasladados los cabellos de una habitación a otra, así que llevó a cabo su propio experimento.
Era una pregunta sobre qué tan probable era encontrar cabellos de alguien, digamos vellos púbicos, en distintas áreas de una casa. Así que diseñé un pequeño experimento llevando a mi casa una aspiradora, la de la escena del crimen, y aspiré en 4 habitaciones por un periodo de 2 semanas, al mismo tiempo todos los días, solo para ver qué tipo de cabellos podría encontrar. Me enfoqué principalmente en vellos púbicos.
Dietrich conservó el material de cada limpieza. Luego comparó los cabellos de esas limpiezas con sus propios cabellos. Dietrich pudo concluir que los vellos se trasladaron de habitación en habitación en su mayoría, pegándose en las medias o a la ropa. Los cabellos depositados al inicio de su experimento estaban más profundos en los escombros de la aspiradora y por eso más dañados. Los depositados recientemente no lo estaban. Fue un hallazgo significativo para Dietrich, debido a que Cheryl le dijo a la policía que Nancy aspiró su casa el viernes. Los cabellos no identificados que se encontraron fueron depositados justo al momento de los asesinatos. Bajo un escrutinio microscópico se descubrió una evidencia importante. Un vello púbico que poseía una liendre asociada al piojo púbico se encontraba en el paño húmedo hallado en el baño de los Newman. Dietrich les reveló sus hallazgos a los investigadores y esperó por una muestra del sospechoso para poder hacer una comparación. Había al menos 6 individuos que eran considerados como principales sospechosos. Los investigadores recibieron listas del Departamento Estatal de Correcciones de Personas con historia de delitos sexuales o violencia liberadas recientemente. Algunas de ellas vivían cerca del área de los Newman. Para descartar a estos individuos como sospechosos, cada uno fue ampliamente interrogado y se verificaron todas sus coartadas. La policía continuó interrogando a Anthony. Él no admitió nada, pero con cada interrogatorio los detalles sobre el lugar donde estaba y lo que hizo esa mañana cambiaban ligeramente.
Todavía estoy muy...
Eso era un tipo de indicador de lo que tendríamos que lidiar con Kirby desde el comienzo. Fueron esas pequeñas mentiras que no eran necesarias, pero que igual quería decirlas.
Intentaba...
Sin conocer el análisis de Dietrich, los investigadores le pidieron a Anthony entregar muestras de cabello y de sangre. Queriendo parecer cooperativo, entregó las muestras por voluntad propia. Estas fueron llevadas rápidamente a Dietrich para ser comparadas. Al día siguiente, Dietrich le notificó a los investigadores que Anthony tenía piojos púbicos.
Por supuesto, sí. Claro.
Eso probablemente fue el descubrimiento más significativo. En ese punto podríamos comenzar a enfocarnos en Kirby como el sospechoso.
Cuando fue confrontado con la evidencia de cabello y la liendre encontrada en el paño, Anthony confesó tener piojos. Dijo haber tomado una ducha en la casa de los Newman una semana antes de los asesinatos para no propagar el piojo púbico en la casa de Dan Grant. Para Jude Ray, el paño sucio dejado en la escena del crimen decía mucho del sospechoso. El asesino se había limpiado en la escena del asesinato. ¿Para qué arriesgarse? ¿Por qué no ir a casa?
Era obvio para mí que él tenía que ir a otra parte a la que no podía llegar cubierto de sangre. Lo que nos lleva a pensar que el chico no está solo, no vive solo.
El perfil conductual de Ray también predijo que el asesino se le podría asociar con un abuso sexual en el pasado. Esta predicción obligó a los investigadores a buscar con más detenimiento sobre el pasado de Kirby. Descubrieron que Kirby Anthony fue el principal sospechoso en un caso de Idaho que continúa abierto hasta la fecha. La víctima, una niña de 12 años de edad, sufrió daño cerebral durante el ataque y no pudo testificar.
Él, antes de venir a Alaska, fue el foco de atención de la policía de Idaho. Estaba en una especie de día de campo y había una niña de 12 años de edad que fue encontrada en el bosque. Estaba inconsciente, casi muerta y había sido abusada sexualmente. Y La investigación señalaba a Kirby Anthony.
Ray también predijo que el asesino querría parecer cooperativo con la policía.
Nos dijeron que el sospechoso se involucraría en la investigación, que estaría llamando para saber qué mostraba la evidencia, y Kirby comenzó a hacer eso.
Lo que los investigadores no le decían a Anthony era que las otras comparaciones de cabello de Diedrich también apuntaban a él. El vello púbico encontrado en el paño era solo una de las muchas asociaciones exitosas que Diedrich había podido lograr entre los cabellos encontrados en la escena y aquellos entregados por Anthony.
Y en este caso, una gran cantidad de vellos púbicos como los de Kirby y Anthony fueron encontrados en las habitaciones. Las de ambas víctimas, las dos niñas, y también algunos similares a los de él en la cama de la madre.
Un cabello de la cabeza de Anthony fue encontrado en las sábanas de la cama de Nancy. Los vellos faciales, que coincidían con la barba de Anthony, fueron encontrados en todas las víctimas y en sus habitaciones. El polvo proveniente de la habitación de Melissa contenía 9 vellos púbicos de Anthony. De la habitación de Angie se recogieron 2 vellos púbicos, uno con sangre y otro con liendres. Los investigadores sintieron que era el momento de vigilar con atención los movimientos de Anthony. Bajo vigilancia, los investigadores conocieron los lugares que Anthony frecuentaba y lo siguieron discretamente por la ciudad. Esperaban que les revelara algo a sus amigos, que luego pudiese implicarlo en los asesinatos. De hacerlo, los investigadores lo descubrirían pronto. El esfuerzo valió la pena. Uno de los conocidos de Anthony le dijo a los investigadores que estaba escribiendo poemas en servilletas y los repartía por las mesas.
Bien, sí. Claro.
Le contó a una de las mujeres que Nancy Newman fue forzada a ver parte de la agresión.
Lo supe porque ella era mi tía.
Los investigadores también descubrieron que luego de los asesinatos, Anthony llamó a su anterior suegra en Idaho y le contó acerca del crimen. Dijo que Angie Newman fue apuñalada y que Nancy y Melissa fueron abusadas sexualmente.
Claro.
En ambas ocasiones, la llamada a Idaho y la escena en el bar, Anthony aún no podía saber sobre la información que proporcionó.
Fue bastante difícil.
La policía no había emitido esa información a la prensa, y los investigadores no se lo mencionaron a Anthony durante los interrogatorios.
Lo sé, no lo haría, ¿cierto?
¿Lo hiciste? Debido a que no se le vigilaba las 24 horas del día, a menudo conducían por su casa para ver si su vehículo seguía aparcado enfrente. Si estaba en casa, los investigadores pedían hacerle algunas preguntas. Las pruebas circunstanciales en contra de Anthony estaban aumentando. Durante una visita a su residencia, los investigadores encontraron una cámara fotográfica que pertenecía a John Newman y fue reportada como perdida luego de los asesinatos. Les dijo a los detectives que los Newman se la habían prestado, pero cuando le pidieron demostrar cómo funcionaba, parecía no tener idea de cómo usarla. Otro objeto perdido de la casa de los Newman parecía guiarlos hacia Anthony. El dinero extraviado proveniente de la lata de galletas que solo contenía monedas. 3 amigos de Anthony le contaron a la policía que lo habían visto envolviendo monedas o pagando con fajos de monedas. Luego estaban las huellas. La huella palmar de Anthony fue encontrada en la pared sobre la cama donde Melissa Newman fue abusada. Las huellas halladas en la lata de galletas sobre la mesa de la cocina coincidían con las de Anthony. También encontraron sus huellas en el armario de la sala y en la puerta principal del apartamento.
Otro lugar en donde hallamos las huellas de Kirby fue en la parte trasera de la puerta de la habitación de la madre. Una vez más, su posición era tan significativa que nos llevó a creer que quizás alguien intentaba escapar de la habitación. Y él ya tenía otras evidencias en su mano. Cerró la puerta con fuerza, dejando no solo sus huellas, sino también otras evidencias que fueron encontradas en la escena.
La evidencia era abrumadora. En el largo mes de investigación, cada sospechoso fue descartado excepto por Kirby Anthony.
Muchas gracias.
Cuando llegó a casa, ¿había alguien ahí?
Para los investigadores, era el momento de emitir una orden de captura.
Llegó hace 2 meses con su...
Judd Ray les advirtió a los investigadores que el asesino intentaría escapar si se sentía demasiado presionado. La creciente intensidad de los interrogatorios policiales puso a Anthony nervioso.
¿Había alguien más ahí?
No lo sé. ¿Qué tal, amigo?
Judd Ray tenía razón. Anthony le contó a su compañero Dan Grant que se iría del pueblo.
Nada,
Está
no
bien.
sé
Le
nada.
pidió no decirle a la policía.
Sí, buena suerte, amigo.
Grant temía contactar a la policía de Anchorage por el mal temperamento de Anthony. No obstante, finalmente llamó 7 horas más tarde.
Bien.
Anthony se dirigía a la frontera con Canadá, un viaje de 8 horas en auto. Ya tenía 7 horas conduciendo. Anchorage y la frontera con Canadá están separados por cientos de miles de tierras deshabitadas. Anthony podía estar escondido en cualquier parte. La policía contactó rápidamente a la oficina de aduanas de la frontera entre Alaska y Canadá. Describieron a Anthony y a su vehículo y le dijeron al oficial de aduana que Anthony era sospechoso por triple homicidio. Esperaban que estuviese en camino. Casi una hora más tarde, Anthony llegó a la oficina de aduanas. Sin saber que los investigadores les habían avisado, Anthony se detuvo tranquilamente en la entrada de la aduana.
¿Qué ocurre?
Fue detenido e interrogado hasta que la Policía Estatal de Alaska llegó. Fue arrestado por conducir con una licencia suspendida y fue regresado a Anchorage.
Gracias a todos por la bienvenida.
Mientras era entregado a la policía de Anchorage, le leyeron sus derechos y fue acusado. Triple asesinato de primer grado, 2 abusos sexuales y un secuestro
No
consumado.
todo es como parece.
Bajo las leyes de Alaska se puede acusar a alguien de secuestro si la víctima fue atada durante la agresión. Melissa Newman había sido atada durante el ataque.
Comenzó a gritar sobresaltado. ¿De qué secuestro hablan? Lo cual nos pareció extraño porque había sido acusado de triple homicidio y de 2 abusos sexuales, pero él gritaba por ser acusado de secuestro.
Para ese momento, la evidencia forense estaba tan completa que la policía creía poder reconstruir cómo fueron brutalmente asesinadas Angie, Melissa y Nancy. La última vez que Cheryl Chapman vio a su hermana con vida fue el viernes 13 de marzo. Cheryl, Paul y Nancy habían llegado por separado al restaurante donde Nancy trabajaba para tomarse algo. La hija de Cheryl, Kelly, había llevado a nadar a las hijas de Nancy para que ellos tuvieran la noche libre.
Debo irme. Estoy
Paul Chapman debía irse temprano del restaurante para buscar a su hijo,
descansa.
pero planeaba verlas más tarde en el apartamento de Nancy.
Buen chico. ¿Sabes lo que dijo?
Cuando se iban, Cheryl le sugirió a Nancy que dejara su auto en el restaurante y se fuera con ella. Nancy tenía el sábado libre y Paul la llevaría a buscar su auto mañana.
Sí. ¿A
las
qué hora
11?
vienes? ¿A las 11?
Sí.
Bien, vamos.
Cheryl, Paul y Nancy terminaron en el apartamento de Newman para esperar a Kelly y a las niñas. Se sentaron, reían y hablaban hasta las 9:45 cuando las chicas llegaron. Kelly les había comprado unas hamburguesas. Cerca de las 10 de la noche, Cheryl y Paul estaban listos para irse. Cheryl ayudó a Nancy a limpiar la mesa y colocó las tazas de café en el fregadero. Angie estaba en pijamas y Melissa había ido a su habitación para irse a dormir.
Déjalo allí, yo lo hago.
Cuando se despedían, Paul le dijo a Nancy que lo llamara al día siguiente si quería que la llevara hasta su auto.
Gracias.
Entre las 7 de la mañana y el mediodía del sábado 14 de marzo, Kirby Anthony llegó al apartamento de los Newman. Él es la única persona que sabe qué pasó después. Quizás Nancy se rehusó a prestarle dinero, quizás rechazó una insinuación sexual, quizás le pidió que saliera de su apartamento. Sea lo que haya sido, su ira explotó. Las evidencias indicaron que parte de la agresión a Melissa ocurrió en la habitación de su madre. Ambas tuvieron que haber sido atadas y sus cuerpos mostraban señales de que así fue.
Podemos demostrar a través de hallazgos serológicos que Melissa, la niña de 8 años, fue agredida en la habitación de su madre, que estaba diagonal a la cama y estaba sangrando en ese momento. Y luego fue sometida de alguna manera y mantenida en una posición en ese lugar por un periodo de tiempo.
Melissa Newman probablemente presenció la violación y el asesinato de su madre. Luego fue llevada a su habitación donde fue agredida de nuevo y asesinada. El cuchillo utilizado para asesinar a Angie nunca fue recuperado. No quedó claro si fue la primera en asesinar o la última. Lo que sí es seguro es que pareció haber sido el blanco de una horrible y descontrolada ira. Nancy Newman no llamó al día siguiente a Paul Chapman para que la llevara hasta su auto, ni respondió a su teléfono las muchas veces que su hermana intentó contactarla. En su lugar, los cuerpos de ella y sus hijas fueron encontrados sin vida casi un día después. El rencor en contra de Angie pudo haberse creado en las pocas veces que Anthony cuidó a las niñas. Según dicen, la llamaba maleducada. Pero para los cercanos a las víctimas y los investigadores que trabajaron en el caso, nada explica el salvajismo de Kirby Anthony.
Creo que no puede separar cualquier cosa que pudo haber causado que un hombre tuviera un ataque homicida como el de Anthony. Y la mayoría de las veces creo que Kirby Anthony no sabría decir por qué él haría algo como eso.
Un John Newman muy afligido estuvo sentado en completo silencio durante el juicio de su sobrino. Luego de 8 semanas de declaraciones, el jurado llegó a un veredicto el 3 de junio de 1988. Anthony, sin barba, se veía muy confiado mientras esperaba por la decisión. A medida que se leía cada veredicto de culpabilidad, la compostura de Anthony se desintegró, hasta que al final se desmoronó por completo. Fue sentenciado a 357 años por sus crímenes. La condena de Kirby Anthony casi representaba un manual de trabajo policial cooperativo. La policía de Anchorage le proporcionó la evidencia recolectada al FBI de una escena del crimen cuidadosamente protegida. Doug Dietrich analizó con cuidado los cabellos y fibras y anticipó las excusas de Kirby Anthony, llevando a cabo su propio experimento en casa para refutarlas. La ayuda de Judd Ray permitió que la policía estuviese a un paso más adelante de los pensamientos y acciones de Anthony, y por primera vez, la declaración de un perfilador del FBI fue aceptada en la corte.
Fue un buen caso para tantear el terreno y probar si esto sería o no sería aceptado en nuestro sistema judicial. Y por eso, las consecuencias fueron trascendentales. Eso nos abrió una puerta.